Okay, we've got about 2 minutes after, and with the number of questions we have about herbs, I want to go ahead and get started because this is going to be great. We have a fantastic panel today, so we welcome them. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. We are in a meeting format instead of a webinar format, so that means that I'm going to ask everybody to keep themselves muted with this number of people. It can get a little distracting if we hear some background noise or dogs or cats or babies, whatever the case might be. We all might have our loved ones here watching with us, which is great. But in order to see and hear our speakers, if you can keep yourself muted, it's always helpful if you go up to the upper right and put yourself on speaker view. That way you'll be looking at actually the people who are speaking. That's just kind of a nice little Zoom feature, is the person who is talking is the one who will show up on your screen. And I do have a PowerPoint up here, these beautiful herbs, just to entice you to grow more herbs, hopefully. And what I want to do now is introduce our speakers. And after that, I am going to take the PowerPoint down. I know last time we had one of these webinars, suddenly a lot of people were, I can't see the PowerPoint, I can't see the PowerPoint. Well, we don't really have a PowerPoint. We are just going to watch our panelists and listen to what they have to say, because they're going to be sharing all kinds of wonderful things about growing with herbs. So let's start with, I went alphabetical by last name. So Shayna Bronstein is from Inza Vitalis, and she has a lot of experience growing in both the Pacific Northwest and along the West Coast. So she is that side of the country experience. Josh Kirschenbaum, maybe you can wave, is with Pan American Seed, and he has a lot of experience on both the West Coast and in the Midwest. And then Chrissy Moore, if Chrissy can wave, she is with the U.S. National Arboretum. She takes care of all the herbs, I believe, right, Chrissy?
Yes.
And also with the Herb Society of America. And we are working, we meaning National Garden Bureau, which I'll get to myself. I forgot to introduce myself. We meaning National Garden Bureau is working with Herb Society of America, collaborating, partnering on basically providing education about gardening, specifically with HSA, it's Gardening with Herbs, thus why we're doing this webinar together. She also writes or is the co-writer of some of the blogs for the Herb Society of America. She's on the East Coast, the Mid-Atlantic, in the Washington, D.C. area with the National Arboretum, obviously. So that's where her experience lies. And last but not least, we have Heather Will Brown from Him Genetics. And because of her many years working at the Walt Disney World Trial Grounds, she has a lot of experience with the Southeast climate. And I myself, I'm Diane Blazek. I'm the Executive Director of National Garden Bureau. We're the ones who are pulling together these webinars and moderating. Speaking of moderating, I will be asking the questions, but I will also be monitoring the chat box. So if anybody has any questions about herbs, I think a lot of you sent questions in ahead of time, which was awesome. My list has, I think, 45 different questions we're going to ask our panelists to answer. So if you have additional questions that you didn't email, you can put those in the chat box and we will get to those throughout the hour that we have here. If I can't get to all the questions, I'm going to send them out after the fact. I will do a follow-up email with everybody who registered for this webinar with answers to any of the questions we didn't get to, as well as a link to this video presentation that I am recording. And with that, I think what we'll do now is, Chrissy, I think you were going to start with an overall definition of herbs, and we'll let you take that away.
Okay. I work in the National Herb Garden at the National Arboretum, and our generic definition that we use for how to define an herb is any plant that enhances people's lives, except things that are used strictly for foods. For example, we don't do green peppers, or strictly ornamental, meaning like we don't grow poinsettias. Most people, I think, that come through the garden typically think of herb as culinary, and I think that's what we're going to focus on today more than anything else. We're kind of lucky if people also know about medicinal herbs. So the garden really is about challenging people to think outside the box a little bit on how people use plants all around the world through time. So hopefully, you know, I might throw in a little bit more than just culinary stuff, but for the most part, I think people associate culinary with herbs. So we'll stick with that for today.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so now let's go through our panel. And why don't you tell us what some of your favorite herbs are? If you have a little story or a little reason why, you can toss that in too. So who wants to start with that one and talk about some of your favorite herbs?
I'll go ahead. Well, go ahead. You go, Shana.
It was a hard question because I love all of them. But some of the ones that are my favorites that for my garden are parsley and mint, just because they're so hardy and easy to grow, and they just add instant freshness to any meal. So I really love those two. But also on a little less common, Tulsi basil is another one that's my favorite. It's got like a really sweet kind of earthy aroma, makes really nice tea. Is also really beautiful in the garden when it flowers, and it's the name of my dog, so I have a special connection.
Is Tulsi basil the same as, is it sacred basil as well? Is that the
Sacred
same
or
thing?
holy
Okay,
basil. You
Okay.
can find it. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in here because we just had a question about different types of holy basil. Are different types of holy basil used differently?
Yeah. Great. That's a great question. I am not an expert on all the uses of Tulsi basil, but I will say that for me, in my experience, most of the strains are open pollinated strains. So it's really about finding a selection that works for you in your region, and finding a supplier where you like the quality of the seed you're getting, and going from there to experiment with what works.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in. And I'm not mentioning basils at the moment because basils are king, and I bet they're on everybody's list because everybody uses basil one way or the other in the kitchen. So I decided to focus on rosemary because I live in the South and I am successfully using it as a perennial. So I'm growing it in the ground and I'm growing it in a pot, and I keep it from year to year. So I happen to like a particular rosemary called barbecue. It makes like a big bush, and I use it. You can use it as a skewer. I like to throw it in with chicken or turkey, and my neighbor loves it when I trim it because she comes and gets it for tea. So I had to mention rosemary. Someone mentioned to me that rosemary likes acidic soil, and mine is growing directly against the concrete curb out by the road. So I don't know if that's true, but it's my success story. And then the other one I wanted to mention would be cilantro, because in the South, it's a short crop and only cool season. So we have to grow it early. And now it's already almost too late. If you buy it now, don't even bother planting it. But what I like about cilantro is that once it starts growing tall and flowering, I think the best flavor is in those little tiny feathery leaves that are coming off where the flowers bloom. And then it goes to coriander and the birds can eat it. So I would have to focus on those. And I don't want to hog the time, but in the summer, when you can't grow cilantro, you can grow culantro here, which is not even related, but it's got a long lance-shaped leaf. It survives our summers, and it has a stronger flavor, but you would think you have cilantro. Just trim off those little spiny edges on the leaves, use it for your cooking, and you're going to love it. So those are my favorites right now.
All right, I'll go next, and I will be the predictable one, sorry, but basil is probably my first choice. And I just find that there's tons of ways that you can use it in your cooking. But there's also lots of different varieties and lots of different flavor profiles within the basil world that makes it really nice to be able to do different types of things with it. And once basil flowers are edible too, and those add another added little bit of interest, I guess you would say. I too, though, I'm also going to choose rosemary. I lived in Oregon, where Shayna is now located, for several years, and rosemary perennializes there too because it's a very mild climate. And there was a prostrate rosemary that actually kind of trailed that I used to like incorporate into my ornamental beds in my backyard, and it would kind of cascade nicely over, the walls. And then it also has this really nice like purplish blue flower too, and then just the fragrance of it, something about it just makes me really it awakens me, if you will, because it's just really nice and a vibrant flavor. And then chives is another one that I love. It's another like a perennial herb. It comes back, it can be used throughout the season, and when it starts flowering, one of the things that I tend to find is that a lot of edible plants can also be highly ornamental. And I think that the flowers with chives are beautiful and can be used in cooking too. So those are my top 3.
I guess that leaves me, and I'm going to be the outlier here and not pick basil. But I'm going to actually throw a loop and say creeping savory, which is Satyrius bichidra. So if you're used to summer savory, which is an annual, I like creeping savory. It is more of a ground cover, has a little bit of a woody stem, but the woody stems make it really easy to strip the leaves off. And the flavor is sort of a mixture of thyme and oregano. So I actually find it kind of easier because you don't have to try and get the leaves off of the more tender stems of oregano and thyme, and they literally just like pull straight off. I do like cilantro, but not because of the reason everybody else does. I actually hate cilantro. I'm one of those people who are genetically predisposed to hating it. And so for me, the story behind it is how polarizing the plant is. I go to an Indian restaurant or maybe a Latin restaurant, and they just slather everything with cilantro, and I'm sitting there gagging and trying to pick every last leaf of it out. So I just find it interesting how one herb can divide people very emphatically. The other one that I like a lot is lemon verbena. I think the flavor and the smell is cleaner a bit than on the Melissa. Not that Melissa is bad, which is fine and everything, but I really like the strong lemon scent. And just to jump on what Josh was saying, if you haven't tried one of the cinnamon basil varieties in like say chocolate, brownies kind of thing, if you like that cinnamon and chocolate combo, I think that's a great addition. And then some of the lemon basils. So I'm sort of sorry, Josh, I'm piggybacking on you, but those are my top 3, I think.
No, I think those are some great comments, and it's interesting. I mean, I know that whole thing about cilantro. My husband hates cilantro. I love it, and I think it is about 50-50 on the population. But Josh, you can eat the basil flowers?
Yeah.
I didn't know
Absolutely.
that. Do they taste like basil?
Kinda, yeah. They're a little bit they're kind of a strong basil-y flavor. But yeah, they're basil-y.
They're basil-y. Okay, that's cool. That's awesome.
A very technical term.
Yeah, that is. This is called Ask the Experts webinar, right? So let's talk a little bit. 3 of our panelists are from breeding companies, and so maybe we can spend just a little bit of time, no pun intended, talking about some of the new breeding. I mean, like, why are you spending time breeding? Aren't herbs perfect? What are you trying to do to some of the herbs in your breeding programs?
I don't know if everyone realizes when they go to buy a plant or an herb, how much time and money is invested in making it a new or better variety, and how much testing that is done beforehand to make sure that when it does go to the consumer that they're going to be happy with it. Always trying to, I think the homeowner in the end is the one that has to win. The person growing it is the one that has to win. That's how we all win. And you're making a great improvement for them.
Yeah, I work for a commercial breeding company that focuses mostly on culinary herbs grown on a larger scale. But one of the things we also work on is herbs for potted production. And what I really love is when we're able to take something like a dill that's usually really tall and vigorous and turn it into something that's more compact and grows really well in a pot. And the same with basil, the same with parsley. Some of the things that we're doing with parsley is just making it more vigorous, easier to grow, more adaptable, more bolt tolerant, so that you get a longer harvest. We have a variety of dill called Ella that I really love because it's that compact dill and it's really unique. And so that's exciting when we can bring something like that to people into their gardens.
Shane, I think you hit it on the head because it's not just culinary, it's about growing it in pots and containers too. And I mean, you can make little knot gardens or especially in pots, you're right. You can use them as fillers and spillers with other plants.
Yep.
And for us, I mean, as far as herb breeding goes at Pan American, we're primarily working on basil. We do a little bit of dill too, and kind of similar to Shayna, working on varieties that are a little bit more compact and good for containers. But when it comes to basil, really, and I'm pretty sure that anyone that is breeding basil right now is probably working on this, is finding varieties that are downy mildew resistant. Downy mildew is a very, very common, very destructive disease for basil that can come in at any point in its life cycle and just wipe the plant out. And so getting varieties that are downy mildew resistant is very important. And then even though I told you that I love to eat the flowers of basil, another thing that's really nice about basil is that the longer it grows and before it flowers, the more leaf material you'll get. So once it starts flowering, it usually stops and kind of fizzles out as far as the amount of leaf material that you would get on that plant, and the plant probably starts to die back. So another thing that we're trying to breed for is really, really late flowering basil so that you can get a really nice amount of leaf material for a long period of time.
This is so interesting for me as the end user, hearing the stuff that the industry's working on, because I went back and I looked at what offerings each of these companies have and things. I'm like, oh, hey, we grow that, or oh, hey, I know that. And so I sort of was surprised when I saw some new plants and things like that. So for end users, it's good to know that they are working on some of these, all these different things like late flowering or disease resistance, things like that. And because I make, and my staff, we make mental notes and even do spreadsheets at times, like how are these plants performing over time? So we know whether to grow them or not grow them. And depending on where you are in the country, you might have a completely different response. What Heather can do in the South might be completely different than what Shayna has or what we have. So it is good getting that feedback from all around the country on how things do.
And I think a lot of our breeding is towards compact, smaller plants. I know we've got 2 basils out that are a smaller compact, many of our bedding plant line is, and that's because there are so many people growing in containers, hanging baskets, balconies. I think that's the direction a lot of growing is going.
And for a lot of herbs, that's a great place to be growing them. It's
Right.
a very conducive environment for growing herbs successfully.
And I will reiterate what everybody is saying. I run 2 organizations here, National Garden Bureau and All America Selections. And so basically everything that we're seeing come in All America Selections, including the herbs, is more compact, disease resistant, trying to take care of some of these things that make it harder for a home gardener to be successful. So yeah, across the board, that's what all the breeding companies are working on. So one of the things that I'd like to jump to now is the difference between seed and vegetatively propagated herbs. And somebody had specifically asked, do you have to grow creeping savory from seed, or can you get it as a young plant, or is it vegetative? So whoever wants to address this question about the difference between seed propagated, vegetatively propagated, how a home gardener might get them, how they're different, that kind of thing.
I'll let them go first, and then I'll answer the question once we get through the
Darn it, I thought you
logistics.
were gonna go first.
Josh is up.
Right. Well, just in a nutshell, for those that aren't aware, oftentimes if you go and see a plant at a garden center of an herb, it might have been started or propagated from seed, or it might have been started or propagated by taking a cutting of a mother plant, is what they're called. And there's quite a few herbs, and it really depends on what the type of herb is, where if you were to start it from seed, it wouldn't come true. So like, for example, if you look at mint, there's spearmint, there's peppermint, there's chocolate mint, there's mojito mint, there's orange mint, there's like tons and tons of different varieties of mint. But really, as far as I'm aware, spearmint and peppermint are the only ones that you can start from seed that would come true. So if you wanted one of those chocolate mints, it would probably be started from a cutting rather than from seed. And I am not a plant breeder, even though I work for a breeding company, so I'm not nearly smart enough to tell you why that's the case. It's just a lot of having to do with like it coming true to seed and getting a uniform result. So oftentimes there are plants like, what's the really popular, French tarragon is one that is actually not available. True French tarragon is not available from seed. It's only propagated from cutting. So when you're at the garden center, you might not know if it started from seed or from cutting, and that's fine because you're going to get the plant that you want. But if you were going to start things, you might have a hard time finding seed of particular specific varieties of herbs.
Yeah, just to add to that, from a home garden perspective, a lot of times the plants you might start from cutting are going to be more woody, perennial type herbs in general. And things we want to start more from seed are going to be things that are annuals, maybe that are faster growing, something you might want to have succession plantings of, because you know that's going to grow fast and maybe eventually go to flower. So it's not that you couldn't start those plants from cuttings, but generally that's some of how those are used.
And if it's an annual type perennial, so let's say it's more like an annual type herb, it's more like a basil or something in that category, that you could grow from seed and be consistent.
I just saw really quick a question pop up of what does coming true to mean, and I apologize that I didn't explain that. It means that if you were to harvest seed from a plant and plant it again, you would get the same exact variety. So in other words, like if you were to harvest seed from a chocolate mint plant, you might get some plants, but they might not be exactly chocolate mint again. It might be some other type of, mint.
Correct. And if you went to the store and bought a packet, you're going to be pretty well safe because the breeding companies have really tried to put the right material in there that's going to be consistent.
One of the ways I explain it to people who may not be as familiar with stuff is sort of like when you talk about breeds of dogs. If you want a Doberman, you kind of keep breeding Dobermans with Dobermans to make sure you have a Doberman. If the dogs are allowed to breed with whatever other dogs are around, sorry, not trying to be coarse in saying that, but you end up with a mutt. So if you want to make sure you're going to get, like Josh said, that chocolate mint, you take cuttings from that plant and you are absolutely sure you have the same genetic material and there's no confusion with outside genetics. If you let it cross-pollinate with other things or something like that, you're going to end up possibly with a mutt plant, and that's not necessarily what you're looking for. So hopefully that explains a little bit. Think about it in terms of like breeding dog breeds or horse breeds or something like that.
Yeah, that's great. And since you brought up genetics and breeding, somebody does have a question about genetically modifying herbs. And I think I know the answer, but are there any genetically engineered herbs?
Not that I'm aware of.
Right.
So when we're saying breeding, we're just talking about conventional stuff that it's nothing that's done in a laboratory necessarily or anything like that. It's all done conventionally and no genetic.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So Diane, when somebody asked about the creeping savory, I purchased seed of that because, assuming that the breeders are keeping their plants pure kind of thing, and they're not letting any outside stuff come in. I grew the plant on, but then I can then take cuttings of that afterward, because it is a plant that is conducive to taking cuttings, and I can make many plants of them and put them back out in the garden. And that's one herb that's an example of where you can do both. You can grow from seed and from doing a cutting. Whereas the French tarragon, you can't grow from seed, period. It has to be from cuttings.
Great. Okay. So now I've heard this a little bit. So maybe we can just address the annual herbs versus the perennial herbs versus the biennial herbs. And I know that it's different in different, Heather, you're lucky. You have basically everything can be a perennial. But maybe if you guys can address that in kind of broad terms for everybody on the webinar.
Well, I'll start because you were talking about the southern states, and really we can't grow year-round herbs. It's very seasonal here because of the hot, dry climate in the summer, or the wet summer that we get. So if you don't plant in the right window of opportunity, if you're in the south, if you're in the warm regions, you have from October to maybe sometime in June to grow almost every herb there is. I could name on one hand the things we can grow through the summer. So if you went out right now and bought all these herbs that in the north you're growing this time of year, you're going to fail. You don't want to miss that window of opportunity. Get your herbs in early. November, October, I like October to the end of May and June. So we'll mention a few of the perennial ones that will go through the summer, but yeah, different areas of the country, they are or aren't perennial.
I would say that even if, again, it's a lot of it was what zone you're in, because where in the mid-Atlantic, rosemary might be a perennial for us, maybe a short-lived perennial, a few years. Up in zone 5, where you are like Chicago, Madison, Wisconsin, things like that, you're going to have to bring that rosemary in if you're really wanting to keep it. And it is acting more like an annual for you. So it really does depend on where you are. Biennial plants are basically kind of like parsley. It's like it'll come up the first season and do some leafy stuff, and then the next year it'll flower. That's a biennial. So it takes 2 years to complete its life cycle, and then it's done. So annuals, 1 year. It goes through its whole life cycle in 1 year. And again, depending on where you are in the country, plants behave differently, and you would have to adjust your gardening accordingly.
And do you think extension agencies might be helpful to a homeowner if they're not sure what area or what their zones will allow them to grow?
Absolutely. I recommend people contact their extension agent as much as they can, because they're the ones with the boots on the ground in that area.
Yeah, I think
good resource.
Yeah, exactly. We always recommend that because gardening is a very regional thing. It's different no matter where you are. So, but here's a question that might be for everybody. Are there any herbs that you can confidently say are deer resistant?
And a hush falls over the panel.
Yeah.
You're shaking your head no,
yeah,
Heather.
I'm just like, I don't know.
We, again, I'm just speaking for the mid-Atlantic. The deer we have that come through the herb garden in DC tend not to eat too many of our herbs. I mean, they definitely do occasionally, but it's most of the stuff they leave alone. And I don't know if it's because of the strong flavors or some of them are bitter tasting, I'm not sure, but they tend to eat things, other stuff.
Somebody in the chat said a really tall fence. That's your solution.
Maybe this is a time for me to bring this up, and you can think I'm a crazy person. It's working for me. Some things don't work for everybody. Last year I had a rat problem in my garden, and they were eating everything, my kale, everything. And I go Google everything and see that, okay, rats don't like mint. So I planted spearmint under my entire raised garden. I mean, it's solid. Someone even criticized me like, you're never going to get rid of that. This year, I have not had one rat incident. So I don't know if mint actually works, but it's working for me. I may never get rid of the mint, but I got rid of the rats.
Well, just as a tag along on that story, you know, people are usually complaining about squirrels digging up things too. And I had a friend once years ago who was so sick of the squirrels destroying her flower beds and stuff like that, that she put mothballs out around because she heard that that would help keep them away. And she was sitting out on her picnic table and literally watched the squirrels pick up the mothballs and move them out of the way so they could get in. So I would say there are no foolproof methods, but Heather, if that mint is working, that's great.
Oh, that's good. I think that was going to be one of the topics we talked about is pest diseases, critters. You know, we talked about the downy mildew on basil. Are there any other things that are very common issues with certain types of herbs, and what do you do about them?
Maybe we should talk about soil because a lot of problems are created if you don't have the right foundation. It's like a house. If you don't have that right foundation. So what do you guys think about that?
There you go. Start with that then.
Let's go back really quickly to what Chrissy was saying at the beginning as far as the definition of an herb, and there are many, many different types. And so even within culinary, basil might need different soil types than lavender or rosemary. And so I think it's really, really important to look at it on a type by type basis. You know, I will just say, like, a lot of the more woody herbs, like oregano or rosemary, I mean, those are kind of native to Mediterranean areas where there's really good soil drainage, it's really hot, low humidity, and those are the types of climates that those particular types of herbs perform well in, just as an example.
So plant like plants together based on the region they came from.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
one thing. Oh,
Sorry, go ahead, Shayna.
Well, I was just going to say one of the benefits I find about having herbs in the garden is that eventually they do go to flower and they host a whole bunch of pollinators and beneficial insects. And so what I find is having herbs in the garden usually balances out the ecosystem of the garden by bringing in a lot of beneficial insects. And then also I think what Heather was speaking to about soil health and, you know, also thinking about your rotation in your garden, so you're not planting the same herb in the same spot every year. Those are important considerations to prevent excess diseases. And then, like, if you're in a wet climate and you're worried about a lot of foliar diseases, thinking about watering underneath instead of from overhead to kind of prevent excess moisture on the leaves can be helpful.
And if
I would
I
say-
think if you're planting in containers, you have to be really careful about putting those like herbs together. Certain ones that like looser soil, you can add sand. Has anyone had experience with Core, with that cocoa nest product for extra drainage? Josh, have you?
Have several years ago, yes. Yep.
I think a lot of the potting mix that we use often has it in there to add drainage to it. You don't usually find that in probably your typical garden center or big box store soil mix. So you might have to look a little harder to find it. But especially it definitely is in their professional mixes. And again, it adds, the difficulty is if you have dogs that like to, you know, dig around in things, you know, you have to be careful about what they want to chew on and whether it's okay for them or not. Like cocoa hulls and stuff like that. It's just sort of a side example that people often use for things. So make sure you do due diligence there. I would say, to jump on Shayna, also things like lavender are really prone to root pathogens, root rots, and there are lots of different kinds that can affect them. And I know one of the questions we received ahead of time was from somebody in West Tennessee with clay soil and how to improve the soil. And of course, probably any gardener is going to tell you add compost, add compost, add compost to try and either bulk up sandy soil or to loosen up clay soil. But even at that, I think plants like lavender, they're just really prone to disease in certain locations. So instead of beating yourself up if something starts to fail, then you just need to treat the stuff maybe as a short-term perennial and then move on or replace it. And then like Shana said, don't plant things back in the same place so you're not building that inoculum up too much over time. So you got to keep things moving around.
I know here in the South, if we want to grow during the winter, if we want to grow lavender, we have to put a lot of extra sand. You could use the perlite. I don't particularly like vermiculite myself. Some people add that, they prefer that, but we really have to get that drainage going, because if the lavender or rosemary stays too wet, it's gone.
So we have a question here. They're asking, are you saying coconut coir for drainage? She uses it for moisture holding.
Yes, correct.
So is it for moisture holding or for drainage?
I think you can your soil can dry out faster if it's more aerated. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, everybody else, but I think you can add it also to provide some more drainage in there.
So again, some of the additives might do dual purpose. You know, again, it's sort of like adding compost works for sandy soil and for clay soil. It's sort of, but you know, the different additives in there can do sort of different features, but.
And somebody asked about the pH range for rosemary and lavender, since we're talking specifics with some soil makeup.
Well, like Josh, sorry, Josh, did you want to jump in on that one again?
Not at all.
Well, I'm just thinking like where you brought up the Mediterranean stuff, and like for lavender, they tend to grow on calcareous type soils, which is, you know, more calcium, which tends to be, you know, more alkaline. I would say most herbs probably fit in that 6 to 7 range, and with some of them that in their native habitats, if they are on more rocky soil and stuff, will lean more toward alkaline, but probably not enough for most people. Shana, I don't know what the soil is like out west, if you guys have high or low pH there.
Yeah, it's going to depend on the region, but it's pretty balanced from most of the growers I work with. We don't have to adjust too much specifically for the annual herbs. Yeah, I think that's been my experience.
I just use a bagged myself in my own garden. I just buy the bagged potting mix, add a little drainage to it. And I personally like to use like Black Cow, like an organic soil amendment like that.
Yeah, and I think like one suggestion is, you know, some of these herbs, they're super versatile. So if it's not working planted directly into your garden or your raised beds, grow it in a pot. You know, there's a lot of different ways. And for me, in my experience, it's about finding what works in my house and, you know, where it's going to get watered, where it's going to get what it likes. And sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error.
And most of these herbs you mentioned in your house, but most of these herbs like light. A lot of people try to grow the herb in a closet, and you can't. They need light.
Well,
I'm outside my house. Yeah.
So I live in Chicago, and I only have a balcony, you know, a patio garden. So all of my herbs are in containers. And I will note, we were talking earlier about the hardiness of particular herbs. And I know on the NGB's website, I think it's on the homepage, there's an opportunity where you can type in your zip code to find out the USDA plant hardiness. I think that's really important to do and very useful, just so that you can find out which herbs might perennialize and overwinter. But I'll point out though, like say for example, you know, like a particular type of lavender would be hardy in potentially in the Chicago area. But I've noticed that when I have them in my containers and overwinter them, I don't have as good of a success in overwintering, just because of the fact that those roots, since they're not being kind of insulated by soil in the ground, the roots are more exposed to cold temperatures. And so I don't have as good of a, you know, even though it says it would perennialize in my zone and come back, it doesn't always, because it's in a container.
And you guys also have a lot of snow that helps insulate the roots too over the
Yep.
winter.
Yep.
And for a lot of plants, if they're kind of marginal, the freezing and thawing is what can be the killer. Whereas people think, oh, it's too much snow, it's going to kill my plant, when actually it might help the plant by keeping it from going through those temperature extremes that we often get, you know, at the maybe in the shoulder seasons or something.
Right. So we mentioned containers. Do you have any preference on type of containers? Somebody specifically asked about clay or terracotta. You know, we were talking about Mediterranean herbs. So is there a better type of container for different types of herbs?
If you want it to dry out fast, use a clay pot. If you want to use plastic, it won't dry out as fast. But I caution, if you live in a rainy area and you put a saucer on it, or if you have a hanging basket, I used to always say, take that saucer off the hanging basket because it's going to rain and you're going to end up rotting it. But that's just my experience.
Great tip. So use those little pot feet so that it really drains instead of a saucer.
From my experience, it's not the actual material, it's just it has to have good drainage. And again, as Heather pointed out, the terracotta or the clay ones will indeed dry out the soil pretty quickly.
And the terracotta, if you have a large terracotta, you maybe have an arrangement of herbs, it's a heavier pot. So if you're in a windy location, that pot is going to stay up longer, the wet, heavier clay pot than a plastic pot.
So we had a question about a perennial herb. Is there anything special you have to do? And of course, this is going to depend on zone and everything. Is there anything special you need to do to either divide them or protect them over winter?
I think it depends on which perennial herbs you're talking about. Again, for maybe the upper Midwest types, you know, if you have rosemary, you theoretically could bring it in. All of us agree that growing herbs indoors is a pretty dodgy thing to do. Herbs like to be outside and they tend to just limp along when they are brought inside. So some places they might pile some mulch or something around the root zone, assuming it's something that dies back, not like lavender, rosemary. We don't necessarily want wet, you know, staying around their necks because that'll just rot them, kind of thing. But if you have a perennial that does go dormant in the winter, you could put some kind of mulch or something like that over top of it to give it a little extra protection. But for us, we don't do a whole lot. If it's a tender perennial, you could dig it up and bring it in again with the caveat, or take cuttings of it. And if you have a place to overwinter cuttings in your house, that way, you know, that's why I say tender perennials, depending on where you are in the country.
And
The
if
other
you-
thing I like to, oh, go ahead,
Go
Heather.
ahead. Nope, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to mention the one thing that I do with my perennial culinary herbs like oregano and sage is give them a good pruning, take out any old material, any dead leaves, anything like that. Make sure it's really well aerated, especially in my climate going into a wet winter. I don't like there to be a lot of dead leaves around the plant, so I try to really clean it and prune it well.
And I think you mentioned the winter. I think if you are interested in actually growing some herbs inside and maybe have one of those little LED light hydroponic growing planters, maybe you would be more successful rather than getting some of the larger growing herbs like dill or anything like that. Maybe you could choose oregano or thyme, some of those smaller, more compact herbs for the little garden. You may be a little more successful.
Yeah, you need to keep those either in a really sunny window or solarium type thing, or, you know, like get a grow light.
A grow light.
Yeah, but a lot of herbs are not going to be very happy, and they might be a bit prone to some indoor pests like spider mites and things. So we're not, at least I'm not a huge fan of growing herbs indoors, just because they just don't really like it a whole lot.
And I think we would agree, if you do, when they reach a certain size, they really are happier outside.
Right.
I
Yeah.
will be the oddball here and say, like, oftentimes for cullen, like if you go to the grocery store nowadays, you tend to have the option of buying fresh herbs cut in those clamshells or like in a little maybe 3 or 4 inch container. And if you think about it, at least from my experience, the herbs in the clamshells look terrible when you buy them and they don't last very long at all. As far as I'm concerned, if you want to buy one of those pots and harvest oregano or basil or thyme or whatever else is available to use in your cooking for a few weeks, as long as you realize that if you don't give it the light that we're all talking about, it's probably going to not last very long. But at least you get a few weeks use out of it. You can compost it and then maybe go buy another when you need more to cook with. So that is one area that I think does have some value for indoor growing. And then I also just wanted to say those grow lights, you don't need to buy like one of those fancy, crazy, expensive ones. Like any sort of like fluorescent or LED lighting, as long as it's close to that plant, should be sufficient for just growing leaf material.
Yeah, I agree. I just, I get frustrated when it seems like there's information out there that, oh, you can grow all the herbs you want and year round and you can do this and do that, and they're selling them in tiny little pots, from some of these fly by night companies, which are not our NGB members, and it's just like, no, it's not going to work. You really have to understand the herb and maybe the purpose. And you're right, Josh. I mean, maybe they bring home a little container of basil and snip it off and use it for their pesto. If it comes back, great. But if not, hey, it was probably cheaper than it was in the clamshell.
Right.
And, and I think somebody had asked, well, how do I get my basil indoors to be the same size as outdoors? Well, you're probably not going to. Sorry to say. It's an outdoor plant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just consider that you're supporting the nursery industry. So that's a good thing.
And don't be afraid to trim. The more you trim, the more it gives.
Yeah.
Oh, you read my next question, Heather, because I was going to talk about harvesting. So, is there some general guidelines? I know my husband always thinks I'm killing my basil when I harvest it. And I'm like, well, that's why I'm growing it. But yeah, to try to get him to understand that when you keep kind of trimming it back, like it's a haircut, so it'll grow more. But yeah, any other comments on harvesting different types of herbs?
Yeah, fast growing annual herbs like basil, cilantro, dill, those kinds of things, they definitely like to be trimmed back, assuming they have good vigorous growth. If you don't, they will eventually go to seed. So, you want to make sure you are harvesting them and not just seeing how big it will get, because eventually it will go to flower, and that does change the flavor profile of the herbs a bit.
And I
when you give
believe-
them go ahead, Heather. I'm sorry.
All right, I'll butt in and then you can go, Josh. Is this correct that you should use a 1-to-3 ratio? So if you're cooking and harvesting those culinary herbs, if you use a tablespoon of dried, you need to use 3 tablespoons of fresh to get that same flavor. What about, am I correct there?
I've heard usually a quarter, but third, probably it's more taste preference than anything. But yes, you need more fresh herbs for the amount of dried that you harvest.
Sorry, Josh, go ahead.
No, you're fine. I forget what I was going to say now. I was so captivated by the 1/3 rule that, what was it going to be?
Well, while you think of that, what you were going to say, somebody had asked specifically about tarragon. What's the best way for the home gardener who has no special equipment to dry and store tarragon?
You don't need any special equipment. You just cut it however much you want, and then you can either dry herbs usually in a very slow and low oven, maybe on a window screen kind of thing, or you could even do it in the microwave, very, little bursts and stuff till it dries up, and then just pull the leaves off and put them in a jar. You could hang it in your house if you have a warm, dry place. You have to be careful about that, because if you do have humidity in your house, the herbs can mold. So you don't want to do that. But There's a lot of different easy ways to do it. You don't need any special equipment at all. Like literally you can use your microwave. So
Do you lose any nutrients when you dry herbs as compared to using them fresh?
I'm sure it's, yes, you do, but I think it's probably negligible because really you're not using enough herbs enough to supplement your diet, I don't think, for your nutritional needs. I certainly hope you're eating bigger salads than that.
I've built these muscles on nothing but herbs, I promise.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the flavor compounds are also the nutritional compounds. So as long as your herbs are tasting good and fresh and flavorful, then you're retaining a lot of the goodness of the herb, even when it's dried. And then one thing I wanted to mention too is I love to just freeze a lot of my kind of fresh herbs as another way. If your drying conditions aren't going to be conducive, just kind of rough chopping and putting it in ice cube trays with some olive oil. For cooking, I like to make sure I'm cooking that, not using it for fresh. But I think that's another great way to use herbs when you don't think you can confidently dry them. Yeah.
Yep, that's great, Shana. Yep.
Now,
It
I think
gets nice
somebody,
and
oh,
it
go
gets
ahead.
nice and hot here in the garages in Florida. So you can hang them up with a rubber band in the garage and they'll dry pretty darn good.
Put them on your dash of your car. That'll happen real quick in the summer.
Yeah, I have some old school baskets that I love to dry herbs in the summer when it's nice and warm.
Awesome. I think somebody mentioned succession planting, but I just want to make sure that we talk a little bit more about that and the importance of it, why you want to do succession planting.
Well, again, sorry to sound like a broken record, but it does depend on what type of herb we're talking about. But something like basil, which is a relatively quick annual plant, you can succession plant. So you would basically start it every 2 to 3 weeks so that you kind of have a constant supply over the season. Another example, Heather had mentioned cilantro is notorious for going to seed very quickly. And so by doing that and like sowing it regularly, you'll get more cilantro throughout the season. There's going to be a point in the season where cilantro just doesn't like to grow very well in very hot conditions, and you might want to take a few weeks off at that point. But then start it again when it starts getting cooler, which also happens to be when a lot of your tomatoes and peppers are ripening. So you have fresh cilantro to put into your salsa that you're going to be making.
So here's a question that Chrissy, I think I'm going to direct it to you because it's from Maryland, the question, and it's about marjoram. She loves marjoram and she is just struggling. So how do you get marjoram to successfully grow in Maryland?
You and me both. One thing I want to say to that point is just because we're professionals doesn't mean we're exempt from all of the same problems that you all are experiencing.
Very good.
If nothing else, we probably have it more so than you because we're often growing things in greater quantities than you. We have hardy marjoram and then we have the sweet marjoram. And like you, we don't have a whole lot of success long-term with the marjoram. I'm still, at times you're always learning something new in gardening and we tweak things periodically, grow things in different locations to see if things work better than others. Heather mentioned cilantro, I think earlier on, and for the longest time I was not having success growing it. Now I'm going to try it in a different location to see if that works better for it. So unfortunately, I don't think I have any really good answers for that because I have not found the answer myself. Sorry, it's trial and error. Just like Shana said, it's trial and error.
That's what a lot of gardening is. It's a scientific experiment. Try this, next time try that, change the controls, change the elements. That's pretty much how it is. It looks like we only have a few minutes left, and I'm seeing a lot of questions earlier and today. Let's answer this one first. Are any herbs considered invasive?
Mint.
I was just gonna say,
Mint.
Heather, how's your mint doing?
Mint, all kinds of mint.
It will keep the
But in
rats
a
away.
good way. In a good way.
Yeah, plant your mint in containers unless you're like Heather and want it to keep out a bunch of rats. So what I was going to close with is people are asking about resources. And so I'm going to name several. We talked about Chrissy writing for the Herb Society of America. There's also numerous groups you can join, right, Chrissy, with the Herb Society of America, and that will definitely help you figure out how to grow the herbs specific to your region.
Yeah.
We have a member on here who has written a book. Her name is Barbara Collins, and so we're going to send out links to her books. We also have a whole series of how to grow different types of herbs on the NGB website, so I'll send out links to that. Anything else anybody want to add as far as, oh, local extension? Yes, we mentioned extension earlier, but absolutely. Yeah, go to your local extension office, talk to your local garden center, your independent retailer will be really good. Any
And
other
Google knows
suggestions?
everything.
Shoot.
Google knows everything.
May not always be correct,
Well, then what
but
are we doing on here?
yeah, exactly. Who needs us? So yeah, what I want to do, I put this back up on the screen because our next Ask the Expert webinar is on garden beans. So if you haven't registered for that, go to our website and register for that one. But I do want to thank not only our panelists, but it looked like we have a lot of, as gardeners usually do, people on the as our attendees who were sharing some really good information. So that's awesome. And with that, we have done our full hour. I'm just going to see if there's anything else here. Yes, great herb books from our NGB authors. So we'll send out links to all of those when we send it out. Yeah, so thank you, Josh, Shayna, Chrissy, Heather. Thank everybody else who is on the webinar. We really appreciate it. And we will wish you lots of great luck in the future with your herb garden and all your other gardens. And have a great weekend.
Thank
Good
you.
weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.